Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Strong Cities Network, I am delighted to welcome you to our Refugee Response webinar series, where we are examining different city-level responses to refugees from the crisis moment and immediate resettlement needs to long-term integration and all that entails. This session particularly, we are going to be focusing, this is the second webinar of our series where we are focusing on the day after. The first session was particularly focused on the crisis moment, which is what happens immediately when a city receives a large influx of refugees and how cities deal with that crisis moment. And then in this particular webinar, we are going to be talking about the next phase, which is what happens when cities need to think about sort of medium to long-term issues like integration into the community, social cohesion, and related issues. So throughout this series, we have two more webinars coming up after this one. Speakers from around the world, as you'll see with this panel, are going to be sharing good practices for sustainable and human rights-based solutions to this challenge, including how to coordinate and leverage often competing efforts and resources within a city to address refugee response, to support social cohesion, and to counter polarization in a way that doesn't create or exacerbate existing local tensions that can give rise to hate, extremism, and polarization. At the end of this webinar in the chat function, we will be sharing with you the date for the third webinar, which is going to be talking about the next phase after this, which is normalization into the community when refugees.
Hey, the only part we need to take notes on is,
Sorry, if everyone could just mute while we're doing the intro. My colleague Joe at the end of this webinar in the chat will be telling you about the next webinar in this series. And for the fourth and final webinar, the Strong Cities Network Executive Director, Eric Rosand, will be sharing all of the lessons learned from the three prior webinars. So I think that will be a really interesting and informative session, and I hope you guys can all join us for that. So without further ado, for this particular session, I am very, very pleased to be joined by four panelists who are doing incredibly important work in their cities, and I know that we're going to be learning a lot from them. We have from New York City, Commissioner Manuel Castro. We have from Calgary, Farabors Birjandian. We have from Malaga, Spain, Julio Andrade, and then we have from Columbus, Ohio, Angie Plummer. We're going to be having a conversation with these four panelists over the next 50 minutes or so. I would urge the audience, as you come, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat as they come up, and we will do our best to integrate and incorporate your questions into the discussion. Okay, without further ado, I will turn it over to Commissioner Castro. I'm particularly pleased to see you as a fellow New Yorker, so welcome. You have, I don't know if everyone on the webinar knows your story, your personal story, but you have an incredibly inspiring personal story. You yourself were an undocumented immigrant when you first came to New York City with your mother, crossing the Mexico-US border. You are now New York City Commissioner working on issues of immigration and integration. I know that you've also worked sort of in a non-government, non-city capacity as the executive director of a large organization working on these issues. You've sort of seen this issue from all sides and from all angles. So can you give us a sense, excuse me, of how you, based on your own personal experience, how you and how New York City has approached the issue of integrating newcomers, whether they be refugees, immigrants, or migrants, into the city while maintaining the social cohesion and the social fabric of the city?
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you so much for bringing us together. I am, very excited about our conversation, and thank you to the rest of the panelists today for agreeing to take part of this conversation and share your insights. Yeah, thank you, Jasmine, for sharing my story. I'm very proud to say that I did come to the US when I was 5 years old with my mother, and I grew up undocumented. And it was because of my mother's courage to make that journey that I can now serve as commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs and be able to support other immigrants. In my situation, when I was a child and of my families, New York City has a long tradition of recently arrived immigrants taking part of the fabric of the city. And so we're very proud to, as you can see from my story, ensure that people with my experience are integrated in all aspects of the city's life. And so we try to set up programs and services so that immigrants feel like New Yorkers and feel welcome from day one. So for instance, in New York City, the moment you arrive, we consider you a New Yorker and you are eligible to things like healthcare, low or free cost, depending on your income bracket. You are eligible for a municipal ID regardless of your immigration status. And so with that, we try to invest as much as possible in the community-based organizations that work with refugees and immigrant communities, because we know that often refugees and immigrants come from perhaps home countries where reaching out to their home governments was not safe. And so the community organizations present a different option for them to connect to individuals that perhaps have had the same experiences and can explain how to access city services or other services provided by these organizations. So for instance, we recently announced an investment to support organizations that work with Haitian immigrants. Most often that Haitian immigrants from the past set up themselves so that they can provide those initial services and connect them to those programs that refugees are most in need. Like I said, health is a big one. We have a large healthcare system. We've actually set up a program called NYC Cares, specifically for perhaps New Yorkers with difficult or different immigration statuses, whether undocumented or seeking asylum or with under temporary protective status. Education is another huge need. So our school systems are, prepared to register and welcome recently arrived children into the system. And so we invest quite a lot in these programs. And of course, there's still a lot of work to be done. I ran an NGO, as you said, for a long time that served newly arrived immigrants. And we tried as best as possible to integrate and support immigrants and advocate on their behalf. So I'll pause there and thank you so much for welcoming me here today and allow me to share some of these insights.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. And I'm sure we'll dig deeper into a lot of the things that you mentioned now. I wonder if I can turn it over to Angie Plummer from Columbus, Ohio, because Angie, I mean, you obviously approach this from the non-government sector, but as Commissioner Castro mentioned, there does have to be some sort of cooperation. And I imagine that the success of a lot of these integration efforts depends largely on the level and the quality of cooperation between the city and non-government organizations or local organizations. So can you tell us a bit about your efforts and how you work with the city to support the integration of refugees to Columbus?
Thank you, Jasmine, and it's an honor to be on this panel. parallel to what New York City is doing, and that the commissioner noted, the partnerships between the city and the community-based organizations like ours is essential. We're very fortunate in Central Ohio to have a city government, county government that are very supportive of refugees and immigrants. So first and foremost, the messaging that comes from those offices is very intentional and involved. And then from our perspective, what, in addition to that messaging, and they'll participate with us in press conferences and efforts to make sure more funding is available locally, are very specific projects that they've done. There were a couple I wanted to spotlight. One is, suddenly we were having a large number of Afghan refugees coming to the country. To our agency, we resettled about 318 people in a very short period of time. So knowing that housing would be the greatest challenge to quickly getting people stability, we approached the city, and they set up a guarantor fund so that we could use that to approach landlords to say, the city is backing us to make sure you're going to get your rents paid. I'm proud that we haven't had to dip into that fund, but having it there symbolically was a huge gesture that made it more possible for us to secure apartments quickly if we're talking about the day after. Yes, this is literally the day after, trying to get people out of a transitional housing into something more permanent. Also putting money behind programs like our youth mentorship programs. When I think about belonging and welcoming, that program has such an ability to engage community members, and that's where these partnerships come in. We all know that the funding is not sufficient to meet all the needs of arriving refugees. We really rely strongly on our faith-based community, whether through churches, it could be a group of neighbors, but we invest in resources to organize the efforts of welcome teams and arrival teams to go beyond just the immediate services that are necessary and start on that path to someone feeling like they belong to our community, that they're welcoming. So getting people engaged in our youth mentorship program is one way, so that we're pairing typically local college students with, arriving refugee youth. So I wanted to spotlight those. Other efforts that we make, we have with our cultural orientation that we provide. At least pre-pandemic, we had law enforcement come in so that the first time new arrivals are meeting local law enforcement, it's not under adverse circumstances. They're meeting them, and there are liaison officers who are dedicated to working with the refugee communities. So it's starting to build those relationships and build that trust that's so necessary for people to go to law enforcement if they have a concern. So those are a few I wanted to spotlight. We are a city of probably 60,000 Somalis who have come over, a period of a few decades. Our second largest refugee population are the Bhutanese Nepali, and we have the largest Bhutanese Nepali population in the United States. And then a whole host of other diverse groups. I noted the Afghans. We resettled SIVs many years ago, but with the evacuation, we're really proud to be a part of that initiative. So I'll pause there and leave enough time for my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Angie, so much. And, we spoke before this panel, and you told me about the idea of the law enforcement meeting sort of, so that the first instance that an immigrant or refugee has with law enforcement isn't a scary adversarial sort of meeting. And I just thought that was so fascinating. I wondered if that was a lesson that other cities could take out of this and put into place as well. I'd be curious now to turn over to Julio, and then Farabors, I'll get to you. We've heard two different American perspectives now. And I imagine that, there might be some differences in the European, the Canadian perspectives. So maybe I'll turn to Julio. You've also had such a breadth of experience on these issues from so many different vantage points. People can look at the chat in the chat for your full bio. Can you give us a sense of Malaga's approach to this issue and how you deal with issues of integration and social cohesion in your community?
Thank you very much, Yasmin, and thank you to Strong City. I'm very honored and to be with all of you, the panelists and the participants. Well, I would like, first of all, to give a overview of the city of Malaga, because the city of Malaga is an European city located by the Mediterranean Sea. It's the largest city south of Europe and close to Africa. And that means that we really have a rich culture. We've been a city where people from all over the world come through Europe, through Malaga. And it's a cosmopolitan city where more than 150 different nationalities live here, different ideologies, cultures, religions live together. And this plurality, of course, enriches us. And we like to be a modern city being like that, no? So, well, we are very respectful with all of these people. We try to promote that, as all of you, and tolerance and social cohesion, despite the diversity that we are facing, and we all are aware, no, of all the common challenges that now we have. And it's very sad to see in the news so many problems coming from all over. I can tell you that Malaga, being that far from many places, is a refugee city for Syrian, Sub-Saharan, Venezuelan, Ukrainian, and of course Moroccan people, because we are really close to them. And we all know these people can try to find a better life and trying to run away from climate change, extreme poverty, and wars. And so we've been doing work for many years. Can tell you that the mayor of Malaga has been the leader for 22 years. Very unusual in a major city with 600,000 inhabitants and 3,000 years old of history. And most of the staff, even myself, we've been with him more than 20 years. That means that we have planned 20 years ago where we want to be after 10 years, and 10 years ago where we wanted to be now. And we are doing the same for the next 10 coming years. So we are planning to keep promoting interculturality, conviviality. We don't like to say coexistence. We think that's not enough. We like to promote conviviality and all this by creating new values for the society, respecting each other and promoting the religious pluralism, and having a strong commitment and to fight against polarization and extremism. And just a small comment on refugees, because I'll be explaining in more detail afterwards some of the specific action. Just talking to you about Ukrainian refugees, that we have more than 5,000, one of the bigger Ukrainian communities in Spain, with a major center in a municipal facility, but managed by national government. National government in Europe are the one with the refugee and migration competencies, but we have a strong commitment to support them and the specialized NGOs working in this issue. And these people come there and immediately they get the shelter, the social care card, the permission to work, and of course, specialists are there to support them. And of course, we have shelters and social programs to refugees from so many different countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julio, for that. And I think we're just seeing such a wide variety of approaches and different programs. I'd love to delve deeper into that in the next round of questions and talk maybe a little bit more about any challenges that you might have come across in implementing these policies. But I'd like to bring in Faragors to talk about your your experience, your perspective, especially in relation to these three different ones that we've just heard. So over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invite. I think I'm really honored to be here. I would like to start with giving a little bit of the story about Canada and then come to my city. Canada is a country, obviously, we get being about 420,000 immigrants and refugees. So the average number of refugees arriving in Canada is 40 to 45,000 annually. So as a result of that, there is a very, very solid system a network of community association across the country, plus the government investment and appropriate policies. I think these are important. The way Canada overall looks at resettlement of refugees is really asset-based. We really want them to integrate. We want them to be part of the country as soon as possible to create that sense of belonging. Personally, I came as a refugee to Canada myself in 1988 as a Baha'i from Iran, escaped the country, went to Pakistan, and was very lucky to come to Canada. So this is the vision, and I think that is important. So we know they're here to stay. We want them to be to do well, because we understand if they do well, everybody else will do well. If their children become active participant in the community and feel that they are Canadian, everybody gonna be basically benefit. So we're looking at really a complex but a long-term journey for immigrants, for refugees that come to Canada. There are three streams of refugees coming to Canada. One is government-sponsored refugees, private-sponsored refugees, which is quite unique, and I know some of the European countries are adopting that. And then we have asylum seekers that we call them refugee claimants in Canada. So the city that I live in, Calgary in Alberta, in western part of the country, is about 1.3 million people. And we get average of 2,000 to 2,500 refugees annually from all those three streams. Again, in line with what the national vision is on refugee resettlement, obviously, we also look at them from the day one as a Canadian. We want them to feel that. We want them to be part of the community. So to do that, obviously, there are investment by all level of governments, but also a lot of community engagement. Again, there are so many programs going there. And we know we call people refugees, but the issue is refugees are also very diverse. So every individual go through a different experience of settlement and integration. And I think we, as a service provider, we have to design a program, an approach that actually would cater not general, but actually to family units or individual. And I think this is what Canada does. In my city, I can tell you that there is a huge community engagement, huge understanding what refugees bring to the country, because again, they are in a process, in a stressful situation, because they're overcoming those barriers that they have. We can see, I mean, there's a study shows that they make the best citizen actually for any country if it is done right. So I want to finish with this basic approach in refugee resettlement. Refugees arrive because they lost faith in humanity, because what happened to them before. So I think as a job, as a whatever policy practices we develop, needs to take that into consideration, restore that faith, and also they come with set of fears as well as hopes. And again, these are the concept, these are the principle of designing policy and designing practices and services. If we can remove those fears from their life and help them to build on those hope, then you would have amazing refugee resettlement program or services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fariborz. I thought that was an extremely thorough overview and a good overview. And I think it's great that 2 out of our 4 panelists were refugees or immigrants themselves. And so it just really shows how helpful it is sometimes to bring that personal experience into the job. The perspectives that we've heard so far, I mean, it sounds like all 4 cities have been fairly welcoming and fairly open to refugees coming in or to immigrants. I mean, in New York City, obviously, is well known for being a melting pot. And, my own parents were immigrants to New York many, many years ago. But I wonder if we can do in this round, delve into some challenges that you might have faced, despite the fact that your cities have all been so welcome and that you've all had these really positive experiences. The issue of refugee integration as a whole, especially the way that it's relayed in media so often these days, there seems to be, just kind of a lot of animosity, a lot of anti-refugee sentiment globally, despite the pockets of positivity that we see. I mean, has that impacted your efforts at all? Have you had to deal with any of that spillover into real life? I wonder if we can do a round of of responses to challenges, maybe doing in the same order, starting with Commissioner Castro?
Thank you for that question. I think it's important to also highlight the challenges. I mean, one challenge in particular New York has, we are often not a city that is selected by refugee resettlement programs because of high housing costs. And so the families of New Yorkers who are part of refugee resettlement programs are often placed elsewhere. And so, refugees who are here in the country and might not know the system or culture often feel better when they're closer to their relatives or friends or loved ones. And so they live apart, right? And we are trying to address that as best as possible. Because outside of New York City, it's hard to move around the country. And so if you're housed somewhere, across the country and your family's members or loved ones live in New York City, that is a challenge. Now then there is also the challenge of people who, I think would or should be considered refugees are not, end up trying to cross either the Canadian or the Mexican border, trying to come to the United States without legal status, like the case of Haitian immigrants, for instance. As many of you have seen, the reports of Haitian immigrants arriving at the Mexican border and their treatment, it's a challenge. Many of them are actually trying to get to New York City. So even after crossing the Mexican border, they have a whole journey to New York City. And so we consider refugees or people fleeing from crises or displaced people in a broad sense, right? So we want to welcome everyone and provide the services that they need. And especially those who are fleeing crises, trying to, reach their families and loved ones here, we want to make sure that we have, programs that can address, perhaps the difficulties, journeys that they've undertaken to arrive here with mental health services and other services that help them integrate or settle here in New York City.
Thank you so much for that, Commissioner Castro. I really especially appreciate that you mentioned mental health resources, since, as Faribor has mentioned, a lot of these refugees that come in are just so traumatized, and mental health, I think, is often one of those overlooked resources. So I'm really happy to hear you say that. I want to bring in, before I go to Angie, I want to bring in a question from the audience that maybe we can sort of have in the back of our mind, if one of you wants to answer it in the challenge part of the conversation. They say, we see all too often that initial sympathy for refugees gets eclipsed by anti-refugee backlash. What are the best practices to ensure peace and well-being between refugees and host communities? So maybe one of you wants to take that. But Angie, I know you and I were also talking about the challenges of basic, where do you put refugees? Do you put them in communities of other refugees so that they feel comfortable, or do you put them in non-refugee communities so that they are integrated? I mean, so many challenges to think about. Do you want to share maybe one that you've dealt with that sticks out in your mind that you'd like to share with the group?
Sure, yes, and Jasmine and I had a good conversation about that being an ongoing challenge in terms of placement, because people who are newly arrived, we don't know before they come if their preference would be to live within a community that they're familiar with, that has the same language and same culture, or if they would prefer not to, if they would prefer to live someplace completely separate. And there are many arguments to be made, I'm sure, both ways of how it's beneficial to live amongst, especially when you're starting over and so traumatized, to have people there to help support you. But longer term, does that delay someone's integration efforts? And if someone's coming to the United States as a refugee at age 70, I think they'll probably find the best value in living within community and being with people that they're familiar with. If you're coming at age 5, then you'll learn English quickly, and it may be beneficial to live elsewhere so that there's more exposure to others who already live here. I was thinking about some examples of challenges, and one community who has done very well and are now buying, even buying homes. Still, there's the opportunity for misunderstanding with neighbors because of cultural practices. And new homeowner planted corn in their front yard, which was not appreciated by the neighbor to the left. And so that became a sticking point. And then when there was a death of someone in the community, culturally, everyone comes to that home, and there's a loudspeaker that the priest is on in the backyard. And when they were in the camp, it was customary and no one thought about it at all. But new neighbor wasn't familiar with this practice, and it turned into kind of a unfortunate disagreement amongst neighbors that blew up. But eventually, it really pointed to the need to educate one another about practices. And the neighbor who got so upset said, if I'd known someone had died, I would have approached it differently. And just the opportunity to talk about these things, how really would appreciate if your corn were in the backyard, or I wish I would have known that someone had passed away so I could express my condolences and I could have looked past all this noise. So just some anecdotal ideas. Another issue I wanted to bring up in terms of challenges that we've faced, and I'd love to hear others' perspective, and that is when people enter the workforce. Because in the US model, the system really necessitates people go to work very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. In other models, I know there's more government support for a longer period of time. Trying to figure out what that sweet spot is, because I think the US model pushes people into the workforce a little bit too soon. It would be advantageous to get a little better grasp on the language to increase your prospects. But I also think it's very important in terms of integration and your financial stability and that everything that comes with the pride of supporting yourself to get into the workplace pretty soon, you know, not waiting a year, because it is in that workplace where you start learning language, you start meeting others. So that's something that I've internally, you know, struggled with and been curious about other models and what value one or the other would have.
Thank you, Angie. And it's such a good question. It's such an important question. And I personally don't know what the right answer is to that. I mean, there is a case to be made for either one. I wonder if turning to Julio, we can, you know, and it may be, Julio, in addition to talking about challenges in Malaga, you can offer your thoughts on this issue of when to return to the workforce, because I know that in certain European cities, the cities actually mandate language training for months before, you know, you can really start to go out and get a job and integrate into the community. So I'm sure people would be curious to hear from you if the European sort of mindset has an opinion on that matter.
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, we are, it's not just a Spanish policy, we are under European framework of asylum policy and migration policy. And of course, it should be better that we would have a better and stronger common policy that would support and distribute better the migrants and the refugees in the whole Europe. Sometimes we can hear that some countries don't do as much as they should in this issue. But, well, we are at the frontier level. So we are south of Europe. So we are by the sea and we are in an open area where people just come through. And most of the time, sadly, they lose their life trying to cross over the Mediterranean Sea. So, of course, saying this, saying that national governments in Europe are the ones that really put in practice the policy. We, the cities, have a lot to say and a lot to do. So we try to do our best and we try to have our common actions, of course, also giving to the population the sense of the importance of working for these people, because anyone in the world could be replaced, could be moved, forcibly moved. And so we need to really understand that these people don't come as a tourist. They come because they really need it, and we need to be there. And we don't need to wait to European policies and neither to national policies to act. So we decided, and that was also few years ago, to become one of the world refugee cities. And this was a consensus made by all the political parties. And from that point, we had an emergency commission that with the different administration and within all the NGOs working, have regular meetings to work and to see what in advance we need to do for housing, for money, even opening emergency accounts, cooperating in charity events, giving funds to the NGOs that really are working with volunteers and specialists. We prioritize the humanitarian aid projects also that are delivered in those countries, mainly in African countries, but sometimes also in South America. We support the NGOs work with the refugees in our city. So we support with equipment, with the staff, with funds, all the different refugee centers that we have in the city. And that the city could just say, we wait to the national country, so they put them in place, and we never wait. We are there before national countries, and of course collaborating with them. We have even municipal welcoming centers. We have a psychologist emergency group formed by volunteer municipal servants that are ready there to attend, to be there, interpreters, psychologists, educators, social workers. We have a complex and cross-cutting work done by the Office of Attention to Refugee Families, with all the different administrations at NGO have their staff there all together, coordinated. We try to serve the needs of the refugees and to support the reception of them, and giving them all the different advice, legal advice, so they can get the asylum if that's if they want to. And you know that there is also a common policy to deliver, to deliver the accreditation to be asylum. Also tell you that the UNCHR, the United Nations Office for Asylum for Refugees, we work very closely to them. In fact, I'm also the director of the UN Center in Malaga, and the UN Center is attached to the city. So that's the special link, the city of Malaga and the UN house, and IOM staff, and UN IOM staff, UNCHR staff working there with our team. So, well, we do try to do a lot with coordination and with trying to be aware of what they need and fostering respect and good relation to them.
Thank you, Julio. We have a couple of follow-up questions. I'm going to turn to Fariborz in a second just to talk about a particular challenge. In fact, let's do that. Fariborz, why don't you share with us from the Canadian perspective? I think stereotypically we always hear that Canada is a very welcoming place for refugees. When the Syria refugee crisis was happening, Afghan, of course, there were a lot of sort of good news stories coming out of that. Are there any challenges that you dealt with that perhaps didn't make it to the news, or that you wanted to highlight maybe and tell us about how you dealt with it?
Yeah, thank you. Just want to make clarification. I think we discussed that and mentioned about the mental health. I just wanted to say that mental health is different from trauma. Mm. Refugees, they do come with a trauma, but not necessarily mental health. Unattended mental trauma leads to mental health. I think that is so important that in the beginning that we address that issue, with different approaches. Is not just going and seeing a therapist, but recreation, a lot of other activities that can help people to overcome that trauma that they have. As far as the challenges, obviously it is a challenging. I mean, you bring 40,000 refugees from across the world with lots of trauma, lots of basically hardship that they have gone through, a lot of fears that they come to country. Obviously, the challenge will be always there. But the issue is, again, I go back to that long-term vision by the government, by the community, that these people are coming, they are going to integrate, they're going to be part of this community. I think if we look at it that way, because I hear that people try to manage a refugee situation. We don't manage refugee situation, but rather we resettle and integrate refugees, and we have a longer term vision. I think that would help everybody. As far as challenges, again, everybody mentioned the housing is a challenge. Everything is challenge for normal citizen. It is double challenge for refugee, obviously. I mean, access to services, employment, getting a job, retaining the job, connecting with the community. I think those are all challenges that we have. That is why we develop expertise in coming up with approaches to definitely address or overcome those challenges. One of the theme I always talk about is creating a condition for success. Refugees and immigrant, but refugee in particular, they know that it's going to be a hard journey. They're not going to get the job that they needed. But again, how are we going to integrate in the job? Because I think that is actually just something maybe I focus on, because that's what we do quite a bit of that. I think if you create an environment, a hospitable environment, a workplace, so it's not just people going, be referring to a job, employers, the people work there, they have some understanding of where these people are coming. That is a foundation of really a successful integration into a labor market. And doing an assessment of what they can do well. There are lots of training program and upgrading program in Canada, because we don't want people to go and get locked down in low-paying job for the rest of their life, because people become with a lot of transferable skill. I think those are the things that we know, again, as for immigrant, I'm sure United States or Spain, they are also getting a lot of immigrants. So the same challenges. So creating that condition for success means that when people to go to a job, and I always tell the employers that we don't want them to do charity work for us. We want them to actually benefit from people that we send, because you're going to get a loyal, dedicated worker, but definitely have to have the tools, the ability to do that job. And also employers has to do a little bit more in the beginning. And that's why I think when you look at the employment rate of refugees after a year, actually it's quite impressive in Canada. And you're right, I think we are very fortunate in Canada. The public opinion is very positive toward refugee resettlement, mainly because we have a managed refugee system in Canada in a way that we know who is coming, we are prepared. In Calgary, the city I live, we really match every refugee family with a Canadian host volunteer. So they become a friend for the whole year, and that changes a lot of other things that we have. But obviously, I don't see those as a challenge. These are the realities of what refugees go through, and us as a practitioner and government as a policy maker, and I mean the one that puts the funding in, we have to recognize it is going to take some time. We all have to be patient. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that, one theme that came out very strongly in our first webinar that I think I also see here, which is not a surprise, is the importance of communication, clear, proactive communication about, what is going on, how to sort of view the issue of refugee integration, employment, cultural differences, all of those things. And, this is a question maybe for our next webinar, when we get to the normalization phase, which is, when do you stop referring to refugees as refugees, and when do they just become people again? Because, such a huge challenge, I think, to integration, and a question that someone mentioned is this chat is sort of like always lumping people in this refugee box, regardless of their culture, their religion, their background, and they just become refugees. And what that does to their internal sense of self-worth, and also to their integration into the community. So we have about maybe 10 minutes left, 10, 15 minutes left. I would say 10 minutes left for another round of questions. And maybe I'll just drill down for each of you into a specific question from the audience. Commissioner Castro, because you mentioned the mental health aspect, I mean, can you just tell us a little bit more about how New York City, what you offer in terms of mental health, like how you approach the mental health dimension keeping in mind, of course, I absolutely acknowledge what you said, Farah Boris, about trauma response being different from mental health services. If you want to talk about that, and then maybe you can answer that in the wider context of another question we had, which was just about how a city's health services expand and adapt to meet the needs of refugees or immigrants. So maybe you can talk about sort of healthcare, including mental health, if you'd like, Mr. Castro, just for a couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you for the question. And, so I'll say that, like I said earlier, from day one, when an immigrant or a refugee arrives in New York City, they're eligible for health and mental health services through our NYC Cares program and our larger health and hospital system. And that is important to us because in previous years, previous administrations, individuals had to wait up to 90 days in order to be eligible to these programs that are, as I said, are free or low cost, depending on income bracket. And that's important because often people can't wait for these services or can't wait to talk with someone about what they've been through, right? Or address issues that have been perhaps taken a back seat. And that's important to us because we know that, the moment people arrive and we want to connect them to services, that is the best time to connect people with these critical, often life-saving services. But I'll say something about communication, which you mentioned and is important to me. Aside from eliminating these barriers, early on in my time as commissioner, I've also prioritized language access. In New York City, over 200 languages are spoken, and my office has oversight over language access. And I think it's important for people to be able to connect with someone that speaks their language, right? Even if they can communicate in English, it is often best for someone to be able to speak with someone who might share the language and also their cultural backgrounds. That is critical for our administration. And part of the solution is also hiring multilingual, multicultural staff who also have, as myself and others on this call, the experiences haven't been refugees or immigrants. And so I'll say that because that also goes a long way in terms of, mental health and building community here for people who've had long and difficult journeys.
Yeah, exactly. And we had just on that also, there was another question afterwards, which Angie already kind of raised this, but I just wanted to tell the person who asked the question, should cities resettle refugees very close together in nearby housing and the same schools, or is it better to spread out resettlement locations through the city in order to facilitate wider integration? We've talked about sort of, I think, what we've heard from the panelists is that, this depends. It depends on how old the person is and whether they really are up for starting again and kind of like meeting new unfamiliar people, or would they rather just be around people that they relate to or more from their community? I think there's a variety of factors that you have to take into account. So I think we've covered that question, and every city will have to make that decision, I think, for themselves based on the city's context. Angie, we had a question for you on youth mentorship programs. Do you want to give a couple of words on your youth mentorship programs, and what they entail?
Sure, there's sort of a 3-pillar approach: academics, preparation for post-high school graduation, whether that be entering the workforce or higher education, and then a whole social component. So we ask for a weekly commitment from a mentor of at least an hour with their mentee for a year. And so there are lots of specific things, and maybe it's tutoring, and we engage the parents as well. May meet in the child's home. We have developed relationships with all of the school districts and get referrals through the principals from the schools, or people can self-refer. something important I think about this program is, while much of it is federally funded, there is a local funding component, and then we've also raised private funds. So what often comes with federal funding is restrictions on eligibility, refugee who's been here X number of, years. And we wanted to open it up to any youth, whether they're refugee, undocumented, any youth needing this kind of service. So with that varied funding stream, we can do that. We can enroll, anybody into this particular program. They do fun things like go to soccer games or football, whatever you refer to them as, sporting events, and painting murals together. They've done quite a few murals throughout schools throughout Columbus. Ice skating, all those kinds of fun activities that just build relationship. But really, we're very proud of the graduation rate for the mentees that have participated in this program is much higher than the typical graduation rate for Columbus City schools. And it's a great way to get community members engaged with refugees. To have that one-on-one tutoring, some refugees will be, depending on when they came, depending on their English, may be going to college out of high school, and some may be going into the workforce. So we're able to take them to local universities and kind of expose them and help them. Their parents may not be familiar with the process to apply for college or get financial aid. So we can also help with that, and also have a mental health component, a lot of connections to local service providers at our children's hospital to make sure we can make those linkages as well.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to let the audience know that you had made, this really good suggestion about also how useful parent-to-parent mentoring, sort of connections could be, that maybe, right, that could be helpful sort of in the integration process, as well as having people speak to each other as parents, which is such a universal concept.
Yes, pretty much you can universally say every refugee parent wants their child to do well in school. And I think about myself, my children's school had a program where we were asked for any new family moving in to host them once over the summer, and to just be that go-to person, that sort of peer-to-peer mentor as a parent, and how beneficial, what a wonderful, simple arrangement that was. And I thought, every refugee family coming in, if they'd have a similar go-to person, that relationships that evolve from those interactions, and, really trying to get refugee parents engaged in the school system. So many cultures come from a vantage point of handing the child off to the school and anticipating that the schools will take care of it, but this is a way to try to at least integrate the parents into the activities and decision making.
Thank you. Okay, so for Julio and Faragors, I wonder if, to round this out, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. So I wonder if each of you can, based on your experiences, again, just because it seems that Malaga specifically has had such experience with, and positive experiences with, different types of refugee integration programs and the approach, and Canadian cities in general as well. Is there one sort of piece of advice or lesson that you would like to share with the audience? Especially, this is going to be recorded and shared in our network as well, especially for cities who haven't had that much experience with trying to integrate refugees. Is there one piece of advice that you would give them that you would like to share?
Yes, I would like to give 3 advices. First of all, I think planification is really important. You cannot really tackle this issue with a short-term decision. So we need to have a plan. In the case of Malaga, we started having a major plan 20 years ago, a plan that connect social inclusion plan with migration and refugee plan, with voluntary plan, with a gender equality plan. And all of those plans are well connected. and having a planification for the next leaders coming to rule the cities is the legacy we are leaving. And even that, we connect this with what we call the first cross-cutting plan on strengthening conviviality and prevention of violent extremism that we deliver year 2017 in coordination with the Spanish National Center to Counter Terrorism, because we think it's important to work on strengthening the conviviality, the integration, inclusion, but at the same time, avoiding marginalization, fighting against extremism. We don't need to give extremists the chance at all and to get into this negative narrative, because if we let them to do it, it'll be too late to act. So that would be one of the advice. The second one, capacity building. We are the UN, the UN training branch, and so we believe that officials, politicians, civil society leaders, they need training. They need to understand how to act. And sometimes the media doesn't support at all because they are not specialists in this issue. Sometimes people just get bad news, and it's unfair. So we need to give training and capacity building continuously for that. And final advice, I think we should all embrace the Global Compact on Refugees. The UN Global Compact on Refugees give us so many advices and to ease the pressure of the host countries and city to enhance refugee self-resilience, resilient, secure, and sustainable cities. And of course, the 2030 agenda and the SDG, we can find an umbrella to do our best and to support the condition of refugees and migrants in our cities.
Thank you so much. I mean, the planning thing is just a very quick question. Is that plan available? Is it public, that plan? If you want to put it in the chat, I think that would be really helpful for people to see, because I think it's a really important point. Fariborz, do you have in a minute or so? I apologize, we have to wrap up soon, but would you like to leave the audience with a lesson as well, or a piece of advice?
Sure. I like to give an advice as a very big picture advice. I think the reality with the global movement, refugee coming to our communities, to our country, our cities is a reality. We cannot stop that. So I think what I would suggest is really looking at it and say, how can we really approach this from asset base? How can we make sure we create a vision for success? How we can come up with something that these people, that they come with a lot of hope to these countries, these communities, can actually do their best, like I mean, my friend from New York and Castro and Fariborz, Virginia, and our children, everybody else has done. I think I see, because I do work with some other countries, I know there's a resistance. They're trying to fight it. I think it is beneficial for everybody to sit back and look at this individual as a human being, that for some reason they could not live where they were born and they are entering into their city, how we can make a best citizen out of them. And that needs right policy, right investment, and right intervention and engagement by community. If we don't do that, we're going to pay a price for it. It's just, we can see one of some of the cities in Europe, I mean, I could say that they are having problem, concentration of a lot of refugees in one part of the city. That is not healthy. So we need really to come up with a very comprehensive plan, and I'm sure we're going to benefit from refugee movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As always, this conversation could go on for another hour. So I'm so thankful to all of you for participating. This event has been recorded. It's going to be available on YouTube, on our website. The YouTube video is going to have subtitles. So we'll definitely be sharing that as well. On our website, strongcitiesnetwork.org, we will have the website, but also I'd like to let everyone know that in advance of our final webinar on July 21st, we're going to be putting out a paper that will encompass all of the content from the webinars. So the lessons learned that you've shared with us, the resources, all of that stuff will be made available, and hopefully that will help other cities in this effort as well. So just once again, really, really wanted to thank you all on behalf of Strong Cities, on behalf of our director, Eric Rosand. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did and found it helpful. And I hope that we get to do this again very soon. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.